Okay, we're gonna get started because I want to make sure that we get a real full chance to hear what Eric von Hippel has to say, and unfortunately he has to kind of hurry to the airport after his talk, so we're going to give him plenty of time. And for that same reason, I'm going to give a relatively abbreviated introduction. Even though I could go on and on and on and on about how terrific Eric is, because he has been, for me personally, just an incredible mentor and inspiration and help in terms of my own research. But more formally, Eric von Hippel is the T. Wilson 1953 Professor in Management and Professor of Management of Innovation and Engineering Systems at MIT Sloan School of Management. And his research, probably many of you may have, and if you haven't, you should, read his 2005 book, Democratizing Innovation, which goes into many questions of great relevance to this community about how users of technology both do their own innovation to improve or create the technology, but also work together in communities to do that. And I think Eric is also relevant to this community, not only as a person who's done just amazing research on user innovation and is basically the founder of that field, but also because he has managed to create an incredible knowledge commons about user innovation. And I regularly attend those conferences, and I consider myself a part of that community. And it's quite an inspiration for us in terms of where we're trying to go with the knowledge commons community. I'm going to stop there, although there's much more one can say about Eric von Hippel, because I'd rather that we all get a chance to listen to his presentation, which is User-Innovator Incentives to Diffuse to the Commons, a Market Failure. Thank you.
Thanks. So it's always good when she can't go on too long, because she would get to the point where she will describe how I got thrown out of college for a year for dressing up as a food inspector. I mean, there are many attributes that she is leaving out of mercy, not anyway. So this is new work for us, and you may either look at it and say, oh, we already knew that, I'm going to throw up. Or you may say that in some ways it's interesting, and we have to see which it is. Now, oh God, the slides are going to be, yeah. All right, so the first thing that I want to mention is something that you probably already know from the last few years, which is that many individuals develop user innovations. Now, you know, it's millions of people in each of the countries we've studied, and the interesting thing here is that they are willing to make their innovations available for a commons, in the sense that they're willing to make them leak or allow them to leak. Preventing leaking takes effort. They don't get IPRs, for example. As you can see there in the bottom line, just very few people get any kind of intellectual property protection. But to say that they will make something available, passively perhaps, is not at all to say that this is efficient diffusion. And so what we have here, what's in this book chapter, is something. That's because I'm writing a book. It's about two innovation paradigms. Now, if you look at the bottom, and you may know this already from articles that my colleagues and I have written, but if you look at the bottom track, this is the standard producer innovation paradigm. This is a paradigm where it begins, it's a Schumpeterian one, it begins with either R&D or marketing research, and then you develop something, and then finally you have marketplace diffusion. In that paradigm, there's absolutely no question but that producers want to diffuse. That's how they get their money. They don't use this thing. They are developing it in order to sell it. Now, On the top, when we look at this other paradigm, which really operates in a different way, and where yokai has been a pioneer with respect to peer-to-peer production and so forth, what you really have there is users innovating. They may freely reveal, they may collaborate, and then there's peer-to-peer diffusion. Now, the trick here is that the success of other people, the benefit that other people get, if you look past the end of peer-to-peer diffusion on that arrow to the people who are adopters, the thing is that their benefits are externalities from the point of view of the user-innovator, largely or entirely. In other words, if I am making something, then for myself, I may, in some particular circumstances, have an incentive to have others adopt it, but very often I don't. So even though it's available, effort exerted towards diffusion is perhaps suboptimal. And just to make this very concrete, I will tell you a story of my personal life, which does not involve dressing up as a food inspector. But this, you know, I had a tendon problem, and I went to a doctor, and the doctor said, well, we can do surgery, you'll love it. We just take a tendon from somewhere else and we install it. I said, well, I don't think so. And then they said, okay, in that case, what we can do is we can put you in a boot and immobilize your ankle. So I said, fine, that sounds better. They did it, and I couldn't walk. And I said, well, wait a minute, I can't walk. And the surgeon looked at me as if it wasn't his problem and said, in effect, yeah, well, many people play basketball with these. I don't know what your problem is. In any case, what they had developed for me was some sort of a boot that was standard and that would prevent any motion so that no matter what was wrong with me, I would be safe in the sense of immobilized. So I looked at that and I went and made my own device, which would simply immobilize the part that I wanted to immobilize, and then I could walk. Now, the point is, it fixed my problem. I had some interest in telling others then what, to help. I just had some moderate level of interest in doing that. So I went to the surgeon and said, look, here's what I've done. It only cost $500. The boot cost $700. Wasn't this a lovely thing? He said, well, A, I'm charging you $300 for the visit. B, no, it's not necessarily a lovely thing at all because I'm a surgeon. I don't even care. Go talk to the people who built your brace. So I go talk to the people who built the brace, and they say, well, we have to do things by prescription. Unless it's FDA approved and so on, we can't make it anyway, so we don't care either. Now, the bottom line here is that I had some modest level of interest in diffusion, helping out. But the level required for me to actually effectively diffuse turned out to be enormous. And what would I have to do? I'd have to start a company making these things. I'd have to do some damn thing, right? So I said, to hell with it. So the real issue here is the level of incentive to diffuse that's inbuilt into the situation high enough so that social welfare is served? Now, so as I say, we see these people and they are willing to give it away, which doesn't mean they're willing to exert much effort. Now, some of you in my papers have seen, or talks have seen this kind of thing about center pivot irrigation. And this was a farmer who developed a well in the center and then a rotating irrigation device. Now, this was his device. It wasn't easy to copy, and he didn't make drawings, right? So in other words, he fixed something for his own field, but he did not then go ahead and say, I will invest extra effort that I did not need for my own development purposes in order to make adoption easier. Now, you can see where the social welfare impact of this is, because there were thousands of farmers out there who potentially could benefit and cut their adoption costs in half, let's say, if they had a set of engineering drawings. But none of that return would flow, because there is no market in a peer-to-peer diffusion mechanism, none of that return would flow back to the farmer, and therefore he had no incentive. As I say, it was an externality for him. Now, when we study, this is now a study in Finland, when we study the types of user innovation benefit that people expect from their innovations, initially we said, well, it's all about use. You are making that device because you want to use it. You know, you're making that center pivot irrigation device, or I'm making my leg support because I want to use it. And that indeed turns out to be about 50% of the incentive of these user innovators in Finland, consumers in Finland who have developed novel devices. Now, when you look at other attributes, what you see is hedonic and learning. What you see is significant amounts of benefit are gained from engaging in the innovation process. Those are the biggies. But when you look at those, none of those require diffusion. In other words, I have fun developing it, and I have that fun whether or not I give it to anybody else. I learn from developing it. I learn no matter whether I give it to somebody else or not. I have a personal need. I benefit. Only helping others, which was about 13%, and that was kinds of things typically like a home caregiver helping a patient, their child or something like that. Only helping others and selling to make money, which was a very small fraction for these user innovators, had anything at all to do about requiring diffusion. So what we have here is no real inbuilt incentive, at least amongst these consumers in these national representative studies, to engage in diffusion. Now, the next question is there evidence of under-diffusion? Well, what we see, if we look now at the entire arrow, we see that peer-to-peer diffusion at the end of this cycle, we only have about 33% of the innovators who shared details of what they had done. So for example, that center pivot irrigation person would not have shared details. He would let people come to his farm and crawl around and see what they could glean from his device, but it was all sort of made out of stuff he had around. It wasn't really easy to translate into general terms. And what you say further is that only 17% actually had an adopter. So 33% showed the thing, but only 17% had an adopter. Now, this does not mean under diffusion, because the thing about user innovators is that they are building something for themselves. In a sense, you could argue almost that there's a market failure there too. They don't care if anybody else wants what they have created. They are creating it for themselves. So when you think again about a producer, right? The producer has the incentive first to create something that others want, and then he has an incentive to push it out to others. That's part of how he makes money. The user has neither of those. He wants to satisfy his own demand, doesn't care about generality of demand, and has no incentive, as I've been mentioning, to diffuse. Well, so for the first time in Finland, we asked people whether others would find their innovation valuable to adopt. And what you see there is that about 40% said, no, nobody else is going to want what I developed. It was peculiar to my particular needs. And then a second cluster said 44% of value to some others, and cluster 3 of value to many others was 17%. Now, what we're going to now do is go into diffusion effort. So in a sense, it doesn't matter if these people are right or wrong with respect to the value of their innovation, if we assume that if they are in fact incented by what they see to be other people's needs, they will then exert effort accordingly. So what we have here then is the next step. We say, first of all, let's measure some diffusion pathways. Okay, one diffusion pathway is peer-to-peer diffusion, as you see. Another one is a transfer from the user innovation paradigm to the producer innovation paradigm, where all of a sudden somebody, for some reason, transfers the innovation into a system, the producer innovation paradigm, where the incentive to diffuse does exist, right? Because that's how you make your money in the producer innovation paradigm. So what do we see? And this is kind of the interesting crux, and we have it in another area as well, namely doctors diffusing medical discoveries they make. And the evidence for market failure is this. When you are commercializing, if you look at the first column there, first column of data, when you're commercializing an innovation, presumably you are going to care about whether there is general demand, because your investment will not be worthwhile if there's not. This is also true about commercializing via an existing firm. The first one is via a new venture startup. And what you do see in those two columns is that you see that the commercialization percent goes up as the general value goes up, whereas the innovator's perception of general value. What you do not see, however, is in peer-to-peer diffusion the same pattern. There, as we've said, the benefit to the user innovator from the benefit that adopters get is an externality, we're arguing, to user innovators. And what you see there is you see that there's no particular connection between diffusion and marketplace value. That, we would argue, is likely to be a marketplace failure. Then what we do is we go and see to what extent people exerted effort to diffuse. So we asked first about their intentions to diffuse. And in the paper, what we've got is we've got this amount of effort, and we show that I didn't have time to build a slide exactly of that, but what we show is that the amount of effort exerted is A, small, and B, is independent of the economic value of the innovation. So only 25% have intentions to diffuse, 75% have no intentions to diffuse whatsoever, and effort to diffuse is not the norm. And when it's present, as I say, it's very small. Out of 4 kinds of innovation effort they could have exerted, they on average exert about 1/4 of one task. So there's just very little going on there. Now, how did they do it? Well, some of the stuff was low cost. They posted it on the web and so on, but still, they didn't do much about it. Now, I would argue that this is sort of a fundamental problem in the user innovation paradigm. Now, an analogy in the producer innovation paradigm is, as you all know, gee, there are spillovers. Individual firms develop an innovation at private cost. There are spillovers which lower the profits that those guys get, right? Free spillovers to competitors. Therefore, we have this argument that what we really need is some sort of intellectual property rights. What we really need is some sort of subsidy for R&D and so on to, in a systematic way, compensate for that problem. But now, I think we face the same kind of systematic problem in the case of diffusion with respect to the user innovation paradigm. And what we're talking about at the moment, I think here, there's some component in our discussions of commons that have to do with diffusion, with the willingness of people to diffuse. I mean, Eleanor Ostrom, it was primarily, she was studying kind of resource systems where the resources presented themselves and the only issue was dividing them up. What we have here is the problem that the resource is not necessarily presenting itself, right? So with Eleanor Ostrom, the fish were there. They didn't volunteer to show up to be eaten. They were just there. And then you and I sat around and decided how we divide them up. Well, here, the problem is that the fish, like me, this guy who innovated with respect to my foot, isn't necessarily showing up unless there's some incentive. So a general challenge then is this one. Now, I'm going to give you a couple more examples, and how am I doing on time? Does anybody know?
Yeah, fine.
Fine? Okay, so a couple more examples, and then I'm going to point out in the course of these examples the enormous specificity of the kinds of problems we're trying to solve this kind of market failure, and how we have to get out of that to something that has the generality of intellectual property, even though we wouldn't argue that intellectual property does a good job. It's a very general non-solution, may we say. Just joking because I'm not a lawyer. What can I say? Okay, so now we have this issue. This is Victoria Stodden, who I believe is up at Columbia, or was. And what she studied was diffusion of databases by people in computational statistics. Okay? So they were the authors of articles, and the question was, yes, they would publish their article, but would they publish the materials behind it? And basically, the problem is that you can't really replicate these research studies unless they diffuse these things, but only a small fraction. In 2009, 16% of these people diffused their code, made it publicly available so that others could, in principle, replicate. Now, what you see here, when she collected data on the reasons why people would not diffuse, the most significant issues were cost. Just like that guy making a center pivot irrigation system, the issue there was that he built the system without drawings. He didn't have to make blueprints for his own purposes, but he would have to make blueprints for diffusion. Now, all of you who have databases know that you have to document and clean up that thing to make it useful to others. If you're contributing to open source software, for example, you have to document and clean up. Otherwise, it's just really not very usable by others. And the other thing that was a major one, which is also kind of interesting, is that once you put that thing up there, that database or that innovation, you get people contacting you. You're busy, but they're calling you up, especially in academic fields, and they're saying, I used your data, and I couldn't replicate your results. Now, I'm using a totally different software system, but I suggest you get on the stick and align my software system with yours so that I won't publish an article saying that you're a charlatan or something like this. I mean, there are all sorts of issues involved in this, which, again, create a lack of incentive for people to put stuff out there. Now, one final example. This is physicians in the field who are ones who come up with many off-label applications that are valuable and some that are not so valuable, as a colleague of mine has told me, with respect to drugs. And so, botulism toxin for cosmetics and so on was done by a clinician, actually by his patient, who said, I don't give a damn about the thing you're supposed to be fixing. Fix my crow's, you fixed one eye by mistake, fix the other one, never mind the fact that my muscles are in spasm. So here also what we see is that the users generate most of the new innovations, 57%, but the diffusion systems, we have a whole study that I didn't write the slides down for, but the diffusion system is not at all set up to make it convenient for people to report these discoveries. The diffusion system consists of things like scientific journals and scientific conferences, where the premium is not necessarily on high value clinically. It's on something scientifically interesting. So what we have in general then is we have a general problem, which is how do you incent diffusion? And then we have many, many specific systems, probably as many as there are fields of activity, usually designed for some other kind of activity, and therefore having huge sort of flaws and faults with respect to this diffusion mechanism. And so really what I would like to say, and then we can just go to discussion, here's a question for us to consider. User innovators in general, these consumers, generally don't mind giving free access to what they've created, but they have no incentive to invest to make adoption easy, because adopters' benefits are largely an externality for them. In that sense, it's a market failure. What can be done about this that is in a way general? Specific situations may have specific incentives. For example, there's an incentive to get your open source software code into the authorized release, and that requires and rewards diffusion, and it rewards careful documentation. But that's so specific to that topic. What about kayaks? You know, what about recipes? So the question I would pose for us is, can we discover and think about and develop a general incentive? By analogy, intellectual property is a general incentive to support innovation in the face of spillovers. What can we do, and I just give it to us as a challenge, what can we do to come up with a general mechanism that gets us out of the weeds of all these specific issues that will work across a broad range to increase the incentives of user innovators who are innovating for themselves to diffuse for the benefit of others that matches social welfare? Okay, so that's what I wanted to say.
Two things. One is just a quick, minor note, so externality spillovers don't equal market failure. So I just be careful. Sometimes it's a market success or a system success.
Okay.
The fact. So a lot of times, even in the situation where you have under diffusion, you might need diffusion, but only you might get some diffusion without fully internalizing all of the benefits. So just sort of be a little cautious there.
Okay.
And then the second point is, it's sort of a question, if there's a diffusion problem or a failure in the system, then I would sort of encourage sort of a careful comparative institutional analysis in terms of coming up with solutions to the problem, as opposed to sort of, it's not clear to me that jumping or even looking for a general or generic solution is necessarily I mean, we might want to compare generic solutions with context-specific solutions. Some of the context-specific solutions may very well be moving from user innovation to user innovation communities and the study of those communities and how to build communities of users. And then related to that, the shared infrastructure that generally lower the costs of diffusion. And I think there's a bunch of ways you might think about that.
So I think that's very helpful, and what we're really talking about here is research strategies. And what I notice, and you probably all have noticed it too, is that when you propose something, the counter is they come up with the most difficult possible case and say, won't do that, will it? So the idea that I've always found useful personally with respect to finding simplicity is to take some simple cases and see what the principles are there. So the point here is that I would suggest, and I've been talking to Kathy about this because we conspire oftentimes, I would suggest that an area that is open for this is almost individual consumer innovation, because there are no institutions all over the place. You know, you could sort of simply see if there's something there where this kind of diffusion occurs well with minimal infrastructure. Anyway, that's how I would go about it. Simple cases first.
Thanks. That was very interesting indeed. So I guess I have two questions. The first is on the heterogeneity of value. So you put up some numbers suggesting that perceived value, the user's perception of value, can affect incentives diffuse too much. But I wonder if, in some cases, really valuable stuff will get picked up by third parties through reverse engineering or intermediaries or something like that. Anyhow, even if the user him or herself doesn't have incentives. And I guess question 1B would be, like, how are we thinking about why does it have to be the user who's actually diffusing it? Why can't it be other agents that are kind of doing stuff?
Yeah, that's fabulous.
The second question.
That's actually an answer, not a question. That's good.
That was 1A and 1B. The second is, so, I mean, I think you convinced us that there's sort of a problem here. You've studied a lot of these user innovations. What lessons are there from success stories, and what can we say about contexts where these things have diffused broadly? What are the contexts?
Yeah, see, that goes to his point, where what we want to understand is simple cases and see what works. Almost get into an area where people can clearly say to you, no, it's not going to work across the board that way. But if you can get the general point that if it seems simple and fundamental, that's good. And I forgot what your first thing that I thought was so marvelous.
Oh, we could leave it at that. No. The heterogeneity value and whether third parties will pick up.
Yeah. So that's really good too. So the point here is that we just in the last year or so, I mean, you might have been thinking about it longer, and Yokai, if tradition is the case, will have been thinking about it for 10 years. But it may well be that there's a tremendous sort of new research field here. Yes, why shouldn't producers reach out and grab? And there are systems that producers could do to do that, contests, God knows what. So absolutely, as we work our way through, it's not necessarily the case, you're entirely right, that all the incentives have to be on the side of the user. Yeah.
Provocative talk, and perhaps it's obvious, but I guess one question for the room, maybe who may be a little looking at that. One of the areas to look at this would be the kind of maker movement, including the subset of people doing 3D printing, who, at least just looking, journalistically, not research, are engaged with these issues, including the questions, for patents and such, to come up with equivalents of Creative Commons licensing. So there seem to be opportunities for those who are interested, not just to research it, independently, but to be engaged in how you can create.
Yes, and now, you're absolutely right, and interestingly enough, we've been doing a little looking into makerspaces, and a lot of people are unwilling to diffuse. It turns out they're willing to show, so you all know what maker fairs are, right? Do you know what maker fairs are? Yes, no, yes, no, yes? Maker fairs are these things where hackers come together and they show their wonderful things that may or may not have function, that are cool. And there are a bunch of booths. And people come and they crowd around some of these booths and they say, oh man, this is so fabulous. Can you make me a kit so that I can do it with my kit? In other words, it's almost like all of us want to buy your kit. And what happens then is the guy is momentarily proud and says, well, maybe I can gather my children around the living room table and we can package up 50 of these things. But on second thought, I'm a surgeon, forget it. So many of these things, they do not have the incentive to diffuse even there. They have the incentive to show, but not to diffuse. It's interesting. Yeah.
So I'm basically going to essentially reiterate Pavan's question, which I think is a really good one, which is how do we know that it's not the case that a lot of these user innovations that don't get diffused are really low value, and therefore there's very little loss to the world of this diffusion not occurring. That's why they're not incented to diffuse things. That's why we don't really care if they're diffused or not. And the really
Yeah.
companies have really strong incentives to do so, to go and get the valuable ideas. And where do those come from? I think to answer your last question, the diffusion incentive, it's also IP rights. IP rights are really
Oh, no. Oh, no.
well. Yeah.
Certainly not. No. So I think what I'm really trying to say here is that we are measuring diffusion incentive relative to that person's view about what the value is at this moment. Your question is still entirely valuable, namely, are they right about what they perceive to be value? But what I'm urging you, I'm saying this is really, you know, a brand new area. And it's not that I have fully researched it. Colleagues and I have gone into it by about 1%. And so what I'm really doing is saying, wouldn't you guys like to do it too? And so when you come up with something like this, I say, yes, go do it.
Wait, but what do you want me to do?
I want you to test that hypothesis, for example, if you find it very interesting.
Well, I guess the basic fact I would want first, before I can even tell whether I find this interesting, is like what fraction of overall innovation do we think comes from users, from small users, and has this dissemination problem? If it's 40% of innovation, however we want to value that, that's a really interesting question. If it's 5%, not so interested.
Yeah, I agree.
I would say that.
So what you have to do is recruit a friend who will do that work so that you can decide whether you're interested.
All right, well, thank you.
Although, so I was actually going to ask the devil's advocate's IP question that somebody else already did. But actually, you have an answer to his last question, Eric, which is you spent a long time measuring how much, well, it's hard to measure how much innovation. You can measure, and this is what, they've done with these big countrywide surveys, you can measure how many people participate and how much time they spend on it. What fraction of innovation is really hard. But they do know there are large numbers of people that spend large number of hours. So that's,
right.
And they have specific examples where, like in certain fields, the important innovations came from users.
But the problem is there's also a large number of people who spend a large number of hours watching birds or collecting snakes.
Right. So really, Kathy's right. There are two kinds of studies here that we have. One is retrospective, where we look where the most important innovations came from in particular fields. And we find that most of them, in general, are done by users. And then separately, we have these activity studies where we say, man, they're doing a lot of this. So in principle, it could be that all the good ones, as you say, are getting commercialized. Or it could be, and I think it's more likely, sort of intuitively, there's a hell of a lot of fall off because, for example, this thing that I developed was probably valuable, but I have no incentive to do anything about it.
So now I'm going to ask my question.
Yeah.
Mike's not working, I'll just ask it from here. Or maybe make my comment, which is that the first paper I ever wrote on... That was working. That's the question. Turn it on, I'm sure. The first paper I wrote on user innovation, which was totally inspired by my conversation with you, one of the things that and that was on research tools. And one of the things I thought about in that was exactly this question about dissemination, because in fact, IP lawyers do think about that. We think of incentive to invent, incentive to disclose, incentive to diffuse, disseminate, commercialize, whatever. And two things that seemed at that time to me to be important in this question of whether this is likely to diffuse. From now on I'll use diffuse, I was used disseminate, I think, in the paper, were the sort of the absorptive capacity of the other users in terms of how likely are they to see this invention and be able to duplicate it fairly easily. And secondly, whether or not the invention is self-disclosing in use, which was the term. And so I think that maybe going back and thinking about it in that way might be helpful, because some innovations it's like what Bobbin was saying, right? If once somebody invents it and starts, let's say it's a bicycle or something, they're riding around, and if it's so great, other people will see it, and somebody might start, doing it. But if it's something you're using in your home, or it's not so easily seen that it's better, then the diffusion question becomes much more critical, it seems like to me.
Right. And then again, the issue is if the person just rides the bike by you,
Right, exactly.
then you don't really get much of a grasp. And so
You might or might not.
you might or might not.
And
So
it depends on
the extent of self-disclosing. Yeah. See, this is, you wanted to say something. Please come say something.
A lot depends on whether you want a bottom-up or a top-down approach, or both. From a bottom-up approach, I would want to know to your problem, solving your problem. I would want to know if the rate of diffusion weren't greater in countries that had utility model regimes. That is, these are petty patent regimes that protect small-scale innovation and are easier to acquire than patents. So in theory, if the effort to get a patent and the difficulties is an obstacle, you should find more diffusion in Germany, Japan, China, Italy, countries that have a utility model regime, which lawyers know would be open to this. So you should see a difference. If you found that there was a difference, then you could say, as I've been saying for years, you could then say, well, can we improve upon a utility model regime? And then we could do that, and that would bottom up increase the diffusion rate. But I don't think you'd want to do it unless you wouldn't want to invest in it unless you could show from your figures, well, look, we already have these countries that have a small-scale innovation regime, and they're picking more of this up. From the top, that would be bottom up. And from the top down, it seems to me one of the problems here is that your work is just now, it's becoming really mainstream, and it seems to me it ought to attract a foundation that would put up some funds. Somebody in one of these conferences this morning was saying, well, we're developing a system to find invasive bugs and invasive plants. Similarly, you could have a crowdsourcing system to find this stuff that might be of interest, and you could funnel it towards a foundation or a subcommittee of the National Research Council that would look at it, examine it, and pick out the stuff that looked like it was worth putting money into diffuse more generally.
Yes. So I think Yokai has a comment here, even though he doesn't know he has one yet, which is, the thing about patents and so on is that what you really want is you want collaborative innovation, where you really cannot tie down who the innovator was in the first place. So I kind of think that I'm going to make you the devil instead of me.
So all I would say is actually to bring you back to Brett's original point, which has to do with the framing of the paper as a market failure. And a market failure has some class of solutions that's a little off from the class of solutions that people here spend a lot of time on. If you look at your own data, the highest point of actually investing effort comes in the valuable to some as opposed to valuable to many, whereas with the market producers, it increases with the size of the potential market. I suspect that has to do something with, once you say some, you have an image of who socially it is, who's someone like you. And so there's a social motivation there that's already getting you to almost 1 to 20% effort level, which is non-trivial. So I just suspect that the domain of search, and that really is just repeating what Brett started out with, is less about market failure and more about social failure and failure of creating social institutions. And in terms of defining what solution space you're looking at, even just not calling it market failure could help.
That's helpful. And did you want to comment on petty patents, or you didn't?
Did you have to?
Okay, no. All right, so who's next? Please.
I'll run the microphone.
Okay.
Well, actually, I think this is probably going to have to be the last question given time and your flight.
So the problem with user-innovator diffusing was that they don't have resources to diffuse it or interest to invest in it. So I would ask to what extent crowdfunding could provide a solution to it, or some modification of crowdfunding mechanism.
So in a sense, what that's about is, it's very helpful always, is converting user incentives into producer incentives. In other words, then they're making it for the crowd. So yeah, one way to solve this diffusion problem is to transfer it to producers or become a producer. Yeah, so definitely crowdsourcing is, or crowdfunding is one of those ways. So I mean, it was worth coming here. I mean, it's such a joy to talk to you all, and talk with you all. So I mean, just thank you, Kathy. An enormous fun. Yeah.